Uh, this is titled as Session 6. This is again also Equinix session, Global Trends in Digital Infrastructure and Cybersecurity. We would have a few speakers online, which includes Mr. Vaughn Isler, who's Director of Business Development, Security and Storage with Equinix. Vaughn, are you there? Can you hear me?
Vaughn is just now connecting in, yes.
Okay, that's great. That's great. We have Dr. Sai Goodman, Regents Professor of International Affairs and Computing, the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy, SCP, with Georgia Tech. Welcome, Dr. Goodman. Thank you for joining us, sir. And Mr. JP Perez Ichgudon. Did I pronounce it correctly, JP? JP?
That's perfectly fine. I get all sort of combinations of my name and last name. It's a long one.
So it's a long one. And
JP
the session moderator for this session is Mr. Rick Sibner. He is Principal and Global Chief Information Security Officer, retired from Deloitte. So with this, I would request Rick to take it away.
Very good, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be able to moderate today's session around trends in digital infrastructure and cybersecurity. And I do think that we'll probably bias towards the cybersecurity side of things, but we're certainly comfortable taking the conversation in many different directions. I know each of you has a copy of the bios from our speakers, and of course they were just very briefly introduced to. I think I will avoid being redundant on that fact or on that point, and really start with Mr. Isler. Vaughn, if you wouldn't mind, how about take a few minutes to give us your kind of point of view and perspective individually and for Equinix, where you work, around global trends in digital infrastructure and cybersecurity.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Rick. Appreciate everyone joining today. And as you mentioned, I work for a company called Equinix, which I'm guessing many of you haven't heard of before. We like to think of ourselves as a digital infrastructure company where we allow different companies anywhere from content and media like the Netflixes of the world to financial services companies like banks and credit card networks to locate their services within our compute and digital infrastructure platforms. And the reason for that is they get close and immediate access to ecosystems. So all of that being said, what we see in digital infrastructure and cybersecurity in particular is really around our customer base, which is clouds, networks, large enterprises, kind of thinking about how do I evolve and move into the clouds in some sort of hybrid or multi-cloud oriented architecture. And when they're thinking about that, they think about how they need to change or adjust or enhance their security posture. So what we try and talk to them about at the highest level is, as a company is moving that video content or video workload or financial services workload into the cloud, it's not like they're going to change the type of security functions they have, but where do they need to locate them? So think about things like firewalls, DDoS protection, cloud access security brokers. I mean, I could go identity management. I could go on and the different types of security capabilities that we all know and love. They're not going to replace them, but they're going to likely move them from an on-premise environment and put them adjacent to the cloud infrastructure. And that takes them a lot of thought, as they're going to need to re-architect those on-premise appliances to service-based solutions that are sitting within an Equinix environment that protects both their workloads that remain on-prem and that they've moved to the clouds. So for Equinix, and from what I see every day, the conversation is about how to adjust security controls and re-architect security controls in a more distributed fashion as workloads kind of slowly move over to the cloud. And so what I'd want the audience to take away, from a digital infrastructure, digital transformation, cloud journey perspective is to think about where you're going to locate your digital security or cybersecurity infrastructure in that transformation. So that's kind of what we think about from an Equinix perspective and a cybersecurity point of view. Thanks, Rick.
Very good. Thank you, Vaughn. Great context setting for the session. We'll have Q&A a little bit later as we get through the introductory comments. Next on our agenda, or next speaker on our agenda, is Dr. Goodman, who's there in the room. So Dr. Goodman, Sai, let me hand the baton to you for some opening comments.
Thank you. Is this working? Everybody's okay? The original digital infrastructure. Is this better? Okay, our technical guy knows how to do this, right? Is arguably in many ways the ARPANET that got started in 1969 as a Department of Defense project. The participation on the ARPANET actually grew a lot more slowly than most people think. It was largely a government and academic network. And then it had a big boost in around 1992 with the creation of the World Wide Web. And what the World Wide Web did, among other things, is bring in the commercial world to networking. And there followed an enormous and rapid explosion in users, both organizations and people. And this is where we got started on having this digital infrastructure become worldwide and have billions of people and organizations on this thing that we're now calling the internet or whatever it is. And one of the problems we had with this is that all of it was put together in such a way that very little thought was given to security. And everybody was having a good time. And the great majority of the organizations and the people on it, and we're now talking into the 1990s, were good users, were making good use of it. But access was the primary, if you like, goal of much of what was being done. To get as many people and organizations actively using this, it became the basis of the various commercial models or what have you, advertising and so on. And there's a small fraction of people and organizations that were relatively unfriendly for this, but they were all empowered because of the nature of this digital infrastructure to essentially have access to all sorts of stuff, including to most of the rest of the organizations and people on this. And the hardware and software was not designed, as I mentioned, with security in mind. And there were a tremendous number of vulnerabilities. We can define vulnerabilities as weaknesses that could be exploited. And this is where we started to have very large scale, very extensive security problems. With each new addition to this digital infrastructure, and you can think in terms of cloud computing, blockchain, extensive use of crypto, each of these additions added more functionality, value to the network, but also introduced new vulnerabilities. One of the big advances, if you'd like, or most extensive and most important increases in digital infrastructure is what we are now calling critical infrastructure. These critical infrastructures are large cyber physical networks, such as the electric power grid. There was a commission in the mid-1990s that defined 9 of these things, the transportation networks. This has been expanded to at least 22, recent DHS listing, and includes such things as the shipping container supply chain. Okay? And what these are enormous cyber physical systems, as I just described. And increasingly, all of these critical infrastructures, including such things as water and sanitation, have embedded in them computer networks. And in addition to the physical vulnerabilities these critical infrastructures have naturally, so you can think of civil aviation as having all kinds of physical vulnerabilities, but the use and embedding of these computer networks brings that set of vulnerabilities to these critical infrastructure. Okay? Now, this happens because all of this networking makes for much greater efficiencies in such things with these critical infrastructure. And operationally, all of these critical infrastructures, if you think about them, essentially operationally define modern civilization. Try to get through a day, an hour, or what have you, without using them. Just look around this room as a starter. Okay? And maybe one way to define these critical infrastructures is that if something goes really wrong with them, life as we know it changes. Okay? So imagine an extensive period without electricity, okay, which is one of the common apocalyptic scenarios that are put forward as what can go wrong with the cyber part of this that affects the physical part of it. Some of these critical infrastructures, in fact, have become so embedded with cyber that the infrastructure itself sort of becomes a cyber network, with the physical aspects of it being sort of little end nodes on these networks. We won't go into that in any detail. But in terms of digital infrastructure and, if you like, cybersecurity, this is an area of tremendous vulnerability. Again, these most apocalyptic scenarios involving cybersecurity have some aspect of exploitation or damage being done or what have you to these critical infrastructure. So in the time that I have, one of the points that I want to make is that a great deal more attention needs to be given to making these critical infrastructures cyber safe and secure. Okay? This is not to say attention is not being given, but as a whole lot of examples prove, they are very vulnerable. And it's amazing that a whole lot more hasn't been done than has been done. Let me make a couple more points in the time that I have here. What we have going on in the world today is that virtually everybody, certainly in most developed or semi-developed countries, has become, people and organizations have all become more and more dependent on computer networks, or the digital infrastructure, to use the title of this. This dependency, of course, makes all these people and these organizations, including everybody in this room, probably everyone in this room in two ways, both professionally and personally, at risk in the use and their dependencies on these networks. So how are we doing? Well, we probably all have a sense, and it's tough to quantify this, there's a sense that we are at greater risk and things are getting worse. It's not even clear that things aren't getting worse at an increasing rate. I mean, are we doing well enough so that the rate of increase of getting worse is actually slowing down? I suspect not, given what's being said. And I've watched over decades now all sorts of organizations coming into business, into being, national, international, NGOs, government, what have you, organization that claim, if you like, cybersecurity as one of their reasons for existing. And they're there to help us all. But when you look at most of us individually and most of the organizations in the world that have, especially small organizations in the world, that have become dependent on this, they're largely on their own. There isn't a great deal of protection for all of us in the cyber commons. And when things go wrong, and they often go badly wrong, most of these organizations and individuals are sort of at the mercy of what goes wrong. All these organizations that are out there that claim, again, at the international ITU or what have you, all of these organizations basically are not able to help individual organizations and small organizations and individuals. For example, old people, now that I'm one, I've become rather sensitive to this, but people are no longer employed and they're really at the mercy because their employer institutions that used to afford them some protection no longer do so. Okay. So I worry very much about the great majority of organizations worldwide. And those of us as individuals, again, we all have a personal life out there in cyberspace, in addition to our professional lives. And who's out there to protect us? So every so often, one just happened last week, I get a call, and a call out of desperation. Why should anybody who has problems really call me or any other academic for that matter? From a small business that has been hacked, had become really dependent on the network, we'll call it. And now they're totally dysfunctional because they've been hacked so badly that nothing works. So they call the police or the FBI or what have you. And all these people want is some information so that they can update their statistics. But when a company like this asks, who can help us get back into shape? And they get no real satisfying answer. And I think we all need to be very concerned about this, those of us who think that we are in the business of making for a safer and more secure cyberspace, to really worry about, frankly, the great masses of people around the world. The internet now comes to ground everywhere. It took a while for this to happen. We actually spent decades studying how it happened. But the internet and cellular telephony, another addition, if you'd like, to the digital infrastructure, a big one that also brought enormous new vulnerabilities for all the rest of us who took great pleasure in using wireless connections to do all sorts of things, right? Here we go. So what do we do? Well, I don't know. I'm at the stage now where, frankly, I'm scared to death to do much of anything out there. And I'm cutting down on how much I do in cyberspace. And frankly, being retro makes me feel safer, and I probably am safer. But most people, as individuals and particularly as small organizations, just go on being happily using this, get screwed, ransomware, what have you, and really have trouble coping with it in any way, shape, or form. And it's gotten so bad with regard to social media and bullying on all these kinds of problems out there that are actually security problems, arguably. And they're getting worse, and they now affect all of us. And with that wonderful thought, I'll pass on to the next member of this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. You've now that you've scared us all a little bit, we'll look for JP Echegoyen to try to pick us up from there and have some opening comments, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A following JP. Over to you, JP.
Thank you, Rick. Can you hear me all right?
Yes,
Perfect.
yes, you're good.
All right, I'll try to be positive, but it's unfortunately when we talk about cybersecurity, it typically goes all around bad news, right? Talking about the cyber threats and incidents, and I love the introduction we had from Dr. Goodman, talking about critical infrastructure and how this actually affects our lives as individuals, right? We are some of us are in the business of securing organizations, right? Making sure that companies can protect the information that they have and that they handle. But what about individuals? In the end, a lot of these issues are affecting our daily lives. So quickly, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm JP. I'm CTO and co-founder of Onapsis. You probably don't know the name Onapsis, but we basically secure business critical applications. We work with some of the largest organizations in the world to really secure their crown jewels. When you think about how do organizations operate, think about energy organizations, oil and gas, retail, pharma, regardless of the industry, they all manage their processes through applications called ERP or business critical applications. So we help them secure those applications because threat actors are going against them and are finding the weakest link to compromise those organizations. And I like the introduction that Dr. Goodman made, because he talked about critical infrastructure and how we become dependent on these services, right? Like energy, pharma, food, transportation, everything is today automated in a way that organizations and ourselves depend entirely on networks, on applications operating. But let me tell you a little bit of what we are seeing and the trends that we see in this area of cybersecurity for business applications. Also heard about cloud in the first part of this panel. Cloud is a big push for organizations to migrate their applications and really revamp their existing capabilities and functionalities in the cloud in a completely new environment. Also, digital transformation is another big push for organizations to change what they are doing and hopefully improve. But all of these initiatives are really also introducing not only complexity, but risk. Because every change that you introduce in your applications, in your business, in your digital, let's say, in your applications in general, if you don't really understand how to secure that, if you don't put security as I'm sure you all know about the shift left, SecDevOps or DevSecOps, and all those good initiatives that bring security to the very beginning of everything we do in terms of changes. Now, changing or securing all of that after the fact is way more difficult, more expensive, and in many cases it doesn't happen. So cloud, digital transformation, two big initiatives. Compliance, right? Talk about GDPR, CCPA, SOX, HIPAA, NERC, depending on the type of industry that organization is. A lot of mandates are being introduced for organizations to bring security, to protect our information, the information of consumers, the information of people that is operating with those companies. And last but not least, we heard about cyber attacks, about exploits, about vulnerabilities as well. Cyber attackers are also targeting these. They are going against the quickest way to monetize, right? Depending on the type of threat actor, you may have some political motivation, but the vast majority of the breaches that we hear and see in the news are really behind monetization, right? Call it ransomware, call it data breach, whatever is out there that we hear in the media. Most of these are cyber threat actors trying to actually make money out of that. So a lot of ransomware in the past couple of years growing, and it keeps growing, unfortunately. So what do we do about it, right? If we think about this from a purely technical perspective or purely pragmatic perspective, all of these problems really start with foundational hygiene or foundational cybersecurity, right? So I've talked about cloud, digital transformation, compliance, cyber attackers, all of these things, all of these initiatives that are pushing, introducing risk and exposing our data and the company's organization's data. When it comes to what do we do about it, it all starts with really the basics, right? That most organizations are not very good at. And even when we talk about SMBs or organizations that do not have the huge or vast amount of resources that large corporations do have, it boils down to how do I prevent that SMB or that organization or mom and pop shop to falling into a phishing attack or a ransomware, or really it starts with basic hygiene. So in that area, I think that the CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency from the US, is really providing more and more efforts, has been really upping their game, especially important since the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity that was signed, I think it was 2020. I don't remember exactly the date, but that pushed CISA and the government in general, the federal government, to up their game into how they secure their digital assets. A lot of that can also be used by SMBs, by private organizations. Now, it's important for them to know about those resources. Shields app is another example of and ransomware protection, and a lot of those resources that CISA is putting out there. It's important for SMBs and for all organizations to know that there are things that can be a starting point in this. But just wanted to get some perspectives, some initial thoughts. I'm gonna pause there. I would love to get into the Q&A to get deeper into whatever area you're interested on.
Wonderful. Thank you, JP. Great introductory comments. And I will take just 2 minutes to add to everything that I've heard. So first, by way of introduction, I'm recently retired, served as the Chief Information Security Officer for Deloitte, which is one of the largest professional services consulting firms in the world. And was both the CISO for our business, that is, how do we protect our organization? And then prior to that had been many, many years as a client service professional, serving our clients and helping them to protect their infrastructure. And I guess I use the word protect. If you think about the cybersecurity space, there's really 3 fundamental things that an organization and all of us as individuals need to do. And to JP's point, and I think to Dr. Goodman's points, we're terrible at doing all of these things, but I'm going to say what they are anyway. So fundamentally, we have to secure our infrastructure, protect the laptops, the servers, the mobile devices, put the right software in place to protect that software, and understand in doing so that while we think we are current, we've got the latest patch installed, all of those things, all of that software fundamentally is written by human beings, and there are going to be flaws in it. It doesn't matter how current we are on patches, there are still going to be vulnerabilities that exist despite our best efforts. And of course, nobody actually does their best efforts. So that's part of the hygiene comment that JP was making. The second thing we all need to do, and I think only the largest organizations are actually really any good at this, is pay attention to what's happening. We need to monitor and look at what's happening and how we're being attacked and respond to shut down those attacks. So the largest organizations in the world have the money, the budgets, the people, the skill sets to somewhat effectively monitor their environments. But as you get into the middle-sized companies and certainly small companies and individuals, all of us individually, we don't have the time or the competence to be able to monitor our environment. So it puts us at a disadvantage because we could be under attack and we don't even know it. And then the third thing that most organizations and people need to think about is, when I get attacked, how am I going to recover? Because it's going to happen. You will have some ransomware attack, or you will get shut down by something, or whatever, some random attack will occur. So how do I bounce back from that attack when it does occur? And again, if you've not thought about that and taken precautions or taken actions in advance, whether it's as an organization or as an individual, you're in trouble. Your personal laptop, for example, it's not even a cyber risk. If your hard drive crashes on your laptop and you can't get your data back, you're in trouble. So you ought to take some actions like do a backup every now and then of your hard drive. And how many of us do that reliably? Very few of us. And I'll admit, I don't even do it reliably, and I know I should be doing it. So I suspect that everybody else does it poorly just because I'm maybe more educated. So in any case, secure your environment, monitor your environment, be prepared for recovering when you need to. Those are all great concepts that if we could just do those things, we would take a lot of our cyber risk away. But the challenge is just doing those things requires money, time, skills, and competency that doesn't exist in many organizations. And then to further compound the problem, as Dr. Goodman said, as the technology we all use continues to become more widespread, more pervasive, more democratized, everybody thinks that they're a software developer. They can all write an application to put on their mobile device, and yet they don't really know what they're doing, and yet they're doing it. So that becomes the challenge that we have to figure out how to protect ourselves from ourselves, which is somewhat challenging for all of us. So with those opening remarks from the four of us, the doom and gloom that we've put forth, I'm going to put a question out to the panel to start us, and then of course anyone in the audience that has questions. I don't know the logistics of how to get those to our host, but if you have a question, please get it to our host, and we will get the panel exposed to the question and figure out an answer to address your questions. But let me start that process by asking each of our panelists, if you were to think about 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, where do you see the technology landscape going, the rate of change, the kinds of evolution that we should be expecting, and what are some of the cyber security implications that come from that set of changes that you would see out into the future? So Vaughn, if you're willing, let me pose that question to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rick. I mean, I think JP and I both mentioned, one of them, it's digital transformation, the migration or movement to the cloud. So while I think we've been talking about that for, a long period of time, I would make the suggestion that it's still relatively in its infancy overall. So I think the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to continue to see growth and momentum as, companies, organizations, content kind of moves more into cloud or hybrid multi-cloud oriented, approaches and architectures. So I would repeat kind of the first thing that I talked about and that JP kind of mentioned as well. In addition to that, I think, from a digital infrastructure perspective, we're going to see growth in bandwidth. And, that might be tied to 5G. 5G, network infrastructure from network service providers is becoming more pervasive and will continue to grow over the next few years, which, equates to more bandwidth. More bandwidth has created more data, more IoT devices, smart meters, parking meters, whatever you want to say, that are out there. And so that increases the proliferation of endpoints around the world. And I think the third thing, in a generic sense, you'll see things like AI, ML algorithms come out where we start to learn more from compute and data that's out there. And that'll then be used to, increase the momentum and advancement of technology in general. So how does all that, kind of relate to cybersecurity? I think it's directly related. So as, we move to the cloud, I think you were kind of mentioning this, Rick, in your opening statement about, visibility, monitor what you're doing. So now that doesn't, with the movement to the cloud, you got to monitor workloads in the cloud. You got to monitor data moving to and from the cloud. How are you going to do that? So I think, the security impact is very direct. Apply that to the, kind of 5G IoT trend that I mentioned. Well, now you've got millions or hundreds of millions or billions or however many devices that are sitting out there, probably not all of them secure. So how are you going to protect and secure them and monitor them, over a period of time in the kind of large scale that I've talked about? Or think about, the AI ML trend that I mentioned from a security exploit perspective. So now you have, or will have, all these algorithms kind of sitting out there learning and looking for security exploits and then proliferating that knowledge around. So I think, no matter what the trend is from a digital infrastructure perspective, I think we should all assume, everyone on the panel and in the audience, that those are all going to have security implications that we need to be thinking about.
Great, thank you, Vaughn. Dr. Goodman, any thoughts? 3, 5, 10 years from now, where are we in our technology journey, and what are some of the cyber security implications?
Well, we're obviously, as we just heard, and as frankly we all see around us, there are going to be great increases in our digital infrastructures, to use the title, in all sorts of ways, a number of which have just been described. Okay? So it's sort of a boom business for those of us who are in the business, either of creating more digital infrastructure or of thinking about security. There's plenty for us to do. There'll be salaries for us. What I worry about is the great majority of people and most organizations around the world. Okay, and we have also, we spent years, by the way, with an interesting project that ultimately turned out to be very disappointing. The last continent to basically get wired, if you want, actually wireless for the most part, was Africa. At the beginning of this century, there was something like, I don't recall exact statistics, but we spent a lot of time for the first 10 years or so of this century. Africa had about a 2% landline penetration across the 53 or so countries that make up Africa. There's some islands out there. How do you count Mauritius, for example? But there's roughly 53 or 54 countries out there. And they were having about a 2% landline penetration. And in very short order, and this is one of the most remarkable things with regard to technology and developing countries ever, we had, by the first decade of this century, the internet and cellular telephony, sometimes together, come to ground in every one of these countries with high penetration rates. Okay? Something that's never happened with any other technology. And it wasn't a matter of World Bank funding that when the funding goes away, the progress stops and what have you. I mean, this was really well embedded. People were overcoming a lack of electricity by riding bicycles to recharge their telephones and all this sort of stuff. In some ways, this is absolutely wonderful. So we try to get into this with colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University to do something that had not been done for the rest of the world, and that is, as you get the internet and cellular telephony, why not bring security with it? Establish national certs, establish good practice, what have you. We worked on this. It's very hard for academics to do this. We tried to enlist all sorts of help, and in various ways that on their own, what have you, the ITU and something called WSIS tried to move this along. And it ultimately, the vast majority of people and organizations just went ahead doing what they want to do, have no time to really think about security, did not feel threatened because, unlike, let's say, street crime or something, it wasn't palpable. We have that in this country too. Africa was sort of interesting because it was a whole continent and we're basically starting from nothing. Over the next few years, 10 years or what have, 10 years probably the most that I have, period. What's going to happen? Well, the average person who has enough trouble just keeping up with anything. Okay? This is part of a lot of the political unhappiness in the world today, is people feeling left out or people just trying to get through, becoming increasingly dependent on this kind of stuff. And what are they going to do? The attacks get so sophisticated. Okay? I don't feel, for example, that unlike the early days of spam when everything was obvious, that I can understand the attacks being made against me and the various forms of phishing. Okay? They've become very sophisticated. I've chaired groups for the National Academy or what have you, and the people on these committees have been the best cybersecurity people in the country. And you ask them, and they'll privately say, they can't guarantee that their own machines aren't crawling with malware, regardless how much they know about scrubbing them or what have you, or their mother is absolutely hopeless in this and it just can't cope with the complexity and just tries to sort of use it the way we use our automobiles, right? And hope it'll just work. And if it doesn't work, and these analogies with other technologies like the automobile, they all break down in one way or another. But we've all gotten to the point with our automobiles that we don't know how to fix anything that goes wrong anymore. We take it in to be fixed, or we're sort of trapped by the automobile industry and we have to replace it. Well, there's going to be no analogy for that, not in the kind of time period that was just described by Rick, for the average person on this planet, or the average small organization, or maybe not such a small organization, who really don't care about security because they don't have the time and it's not part of their lives to think about security, and they've been forced by circumstances to become more and more dependent on cyber. They have almost no chance to, everybody has one of these things, right? Or two or three or whatever. Okay? And it's enough to just learn to cope with it and not think about what can go wrong through these things. So I am not terribly optimistic. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Rick and the others on this panel have said. A lot of what Rick said is stuff that I bring up in all sorts of contexts in class and what have you. And I'm part of, what are we, the number 2 or the number 4 ranked cybersecurity program in the country here at Georgia Tech with SCP. And we got all these great students. And what sort of impact are we having on the big world? And we have all these people writing these great papers and what have you. They get awards and whatever. What are they doing that comes to scale that helps the great majority of people and organizations in the world get through this without having to think about it all the time? Okay. And I don't see any good answers to that. I also see no way that most of us can escape it. I mean, this keeps me up at night. And it's amazing. I mean, in some ways, it's a statistical thing. You hope you can get through life without being hopelessly hacked, right? Or having your children tormented or traumatized or what have you through the internet. But that happens a lot. So my answer is what I just said, which is not really, really very hopeful. But we can't ignore it. We've got to keep trying. But the solutions that have been suggested, better overall hygiene and what have you, all of these make sense unless you're on the receiving end of it. And the attacks are so sophisticated that even if you are aware of the possibilities of being hacked in various forms of phishing or whatever, or ransomware, you can't protect yourself against it. I have no delusions that either I or my wife, or what, my wife is actually better than this, although she's become more dependent on these technologies than I am, that we can escape every imaginable kind of attack. And again, they only need, I mean, we can ward off attacks all day long. All we need is one disaster. And it makes up for the millions of times we have dodged the bullet. I don't know, I've asked students and what have you this, and I won't ask this group here, have you been hacked? Do you have any idea if you've been hacked? Do you have any idea what kind of information, for example, has been collected on you by malicious actors who have so far chosen not to act on the data that they've collected on you? Or maybe you don't even know that. And one last thought on these malicious actors is that around the world, for the most part, they can be malicious actors without any fear of punishment. So why not keep trying? We used to go, for example, in our African experience, we used to go to all these African countries. We used to go to these internet cafes or what have you before everybody got their own phones and whatever. And we'd see all these people lined up at these terminals in these internet cafes. And they were largely doing one of two things, one of three things. One is sort of normal communications with people they knew. Two is looking for a way to get out of the country they were in. And three, to figure out how to make money or to do something bad to somebody elsewhere in the world And it was just a matter of time before most of them, they were not stupid people, before they would succeed. And why isn't this continuing? Well, I think it is continuing. And how do you stop it? If you're totally defensive, if the perpetrators, whether they're state-sponsored or on their own or what have you, or part of organized crime, if they suffer no risk, but only perpetrate risk on the rest of us, there's something wrong here. I mean, it's really fundamental. And we set up these digital infrastructures so this is possible. We're the people who give these folks all of this digital infrastructure, partly because it does us so much good. And we're all happy with it until our turn comes to get screwed. Okay. My last happy thought on this.
Thank you, I think, Dr. Goodman. JP, I'll give you an opportunity to ask or respond to that same question. So 3, 5, 10 years from now, where do you see the technology landscape and what are some of the cyber implications of that?
All right. Good. So I'll try to be quick here. I think there are a couple of areas that we have seen evolving over the past years that will continue the evolution. As it was mentioned before, cloud. People is going to the cloud, consuming more services than deploying infrastructure, right? Like applications are becoming services and people starting to consume more and more of those. So as a result of that, we see more complex, more hybrid environments, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, on-premise, all of them interconnected. So from a security perspective, that's creating a lot of risk. Complexity equals risk, right? Because you need to have people that knows or understands how to secure that. And believe me, securing an AWS account is very complex. It's not like really all of those services, all of those variations, you're talking about thousands of different things that could go wrong. The other area where I see us evolving, I haven't seen a significant improvement over the past years, but I think it's on the right direction, is zero trust, especially pushed by this presidential directive also in the federal government, but I think it's gonna also evolve into the organizations as well. That's a good trend. Is something is good to implement, and it's good if it's implemented in the right way. But again, I think it's gonna take time. Probably we're gonna be talking about this in the next 3, 5, or more years. And the other one also mentioned before, machine learning. There's no question that it's being embedded into everything and anything, not only from a security products perspective, right? Adding the machine learning capabilities to security products and security capabilities to be able to detect more and better and faster, but also it's everywhere. So there are vulnerabilities that are popping up because we're using machine learning, right? Being able to fool a machine learning algorithm to believe that something is something that it's not, well, that's also talking about risk and vulnerability specifically applied to the machine learning algorithms. And there's a whole new area of research and vulnerabilities that is coming from that part. And last but not least, something that I don't know if it's 3, 5, 10 years. I don't know the timeline of that because it's been going for quite some time. And we haven't seen really a significant impact yet, but I think it's at some point when that happens, that's going to change the game. Is quantum computing. That once that becomes mainstream and that becomes a reality, then we will definitely need to up our game and change everything we do from cryptography perspective, from security perspective, because that's going to be a significant threat. So I try to be quick and to the point, but I'm happy to take any other questions.
Thank you, JP. So I'll answer my own question as well, and then we'll open for others. So I think that certainly everything that my colleagues on the panel have talked about is 100% correct. But I do think that the problems vary a little bit by the nature of who the user is, so to speak, in the world that we're talking about. So for enterprises, large companies, lots of money, they have different problems than mid-sized companies, than individuals do, et cetera. The big organizations typically have a well-established technology department, and they've got relatively good cybersecurity practices within those departments. And of course, you can always find exceptions to that statement. But they also have a lot of pressure being applied towards adopting new technologies and doing digital transformation and go to market, with partners and all of these other things that oftentimes aren't even being done by the technology department. They're being done by somebody in a business unit or somewhere out in the field. So they struggle with, how do we keep track of all of the different technology related initiatives that are underway, and how data is moving, and how we protect those servers and devices, whether they're in the data center or sitting in a cloud somewhere. So the big companies, they struggle with those kind of problems, and just the scale of their organization makes it quite difficult. The mid-sized companies and the smaller organizations, SMB type businesses, they struggle with a different problem. We've touched on it already. Fundamentally, they're trying to sell tacos or whatever it is they're trying to do. Their business is not about technology. It's about something else. But technology is a part of their business. And so it's kind of this necessary evil in the background that they largely ignore, except for when something goes wrong, in which case then it takes over their organization and in many cases puts them out of business. I mean, it can be a very detrimental, depending upon what has happened and whether it's fatal. The impacts are fatal. And then the third group, I think, is the consumer. And we've talked about how we all have cell phones, mobile devices. But if I were to think 3 to 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, we're going to have a proliferation of technology-based medical devices. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we all are starting to walk around with an implant in our head. So now we start to physically connect ourselves to the technology. And so if that physical connection gets somehow compromised, how do you throw it away? And how do you start over and say, I want to do a reboot? Because the implant is already in your head. And I don't think we have an idea about how we're going to handle those kind of issues, but I may be wrong on the time frame. Maybe it's more than 10 years, but I don't think it's much more than 10 years. And the medical device manufacturers, all with good intention, think that they can solve medical risks, but they will create cyber risks in the process. They already have done that with things like pacemakers and diabetes pumps and other things that have been known and shown to be hackable. So I do think that there's a consumer side of this that while there is exposure and concern about ransomware and things of that nature today, it's actually going to get much worse for the consumer. And that really speaks to Dr. Goodman's comments earlier on about not sure he wants to be around in 5 or 10 years.
I may not have a choice.
Exactly. So in any case, I know we are getting close to the end of our time here, but I do want to pause. I will stop talking, but I'll give a 1-minute opportunity for each of our panelists, if they have any closing comments that they care to share, at most 1 minute, just so we can stay true to the time frame. So
Let me
Vaughn,
just-
any closing comment? I'm sorry, Dr. Goodman, go ahead.
Let me just, Rick and I have been saying a lot of the same things, but just point something out. What I've been talking about, for example, is how cellular telephony basically has penetrated our lives on a virtually 24/7 basis. Okay? I mean, you can be sleeping and all kinds of things can be going wrong in your life through your cell phone. Rick takes it one step further, and I think potentially really quite correctly, and that is it actually can penetrate your body. I mean, this is becoming totally ubiquitous. And it's not a matter of what you call security. Security, in a sense, has expanded as a concept. It's not a matter of who can hack in and steal your money or steal your data or what have you. Is what goes on in social media that, for example, can traumatize your children or what have you. I would argue these are security problems too. They're quite different. I mean, these security problems and the way they penetrate our lives have become, and Rick's statement about actually penetrating our bodies just takes it one step further. It is absolutely ubiquitous, the potential risk there. Now, most of us get through our normal days feeling really happy about the use of our cell phones and what have you. God only knows how many hours we put on these things. But the penetration of this risk in all of its form is something that is arguably getting more and more extensive.
Absolutely. Vaughn, any closing comments?
Yeah, I hope everybody's scared by now because every device in the world's been hacked. No, just kidding. You know, I think all of us are saying a lot of the same things, you know, in our own ways and based on our own experiences. So no matter what the trend is, whether it's cloud or, you know, IoT or mobile devices or whatever, medical systems, I think the big takeaway that I would hope the audience has here is, you know, security should become a forethought and not an afterthought at the end of the day. So instead of waiting for that, you know, compelling event to happen to you or to us, try and be as proactive as you can in building, you know, security related controls around your, you know, your technology and your infrastructure, and, you know, do the best you can around that. And I think no matter what we're all saying, that should be the takeaway, you know, that the audience should have, in my opinion.
Great, thank you, Vaughn. JP?
100% agree. I think the most important part is to be purposeful about it, right? To make sure that you want it. Being secure starts by wanting to be secure, by wanting to really dedicate the resources, the time, and the effort to do that. Now, it's different depending on the type of organization. I think a lot of that is going to come by government organizations providing resources and providing programs to help organizations be aware of the different risks and providing tools. As I mentioned, CISA, I think that's a great example. But it all starts by raising awareness, being purposeful, and understand that these things are not going anywhere, are not going away anywhere anytime soon. We need to focus on cybersecurity because if anything, it's going to get worse, not better.
I think you're absolutely right. Thank you, JP. Thank you, Vaughn. Thank you, Dr. Goodman. I will bring our session to a close. I know we are wrapping up the day for the overall conference, so the Dr. McIntyre and Mr. Gullidge, I believe, are going to do a closing and wrap up for the overall session. But thank you all for your time today.